There's a reason Timber Falls, Montana doesn't appear on most maps anymore. Not because it was destroyed, the building still stands, slowly reclaiming by forest, but because the 18 families who remain don't want to be found. My name is Joseph Kern. I'm 91 years old, and I'm the last person alive who remembers the Pact, the agreement made in 1962 between our town and the families who lived in the high country above us, the ones we called the Old Ones, though they were neither old nor particularly mysterious to those of us who understood. For 62 years, we kept their secret. We protected their territory. We enforced an unwritten code that every resident of Timber Falls understood from childhood. The upper watershed belongs to them. You don't hunt there. You don't log there. You don't even speak of what you've seen there. In return, they left us alone. More than that, they helped us, in ways subtle and profound, in ways I'm only now free to explain. It was a good arrangement, a fair one. It kept our town alive through economic collapse, kept our children safe through decades when other mountain communities withered and died. It was built on mutual respect, maintained by silence, and honored by both sides without fail. Until last November, when a journalist named Marcus Webb drove into town with a laptop full of satellite imagery, a YouTube channel with 4 million subscribers, and absolutely no understanding of what he was about to destroy. Webb spent 3 weeks in Timber Falls. He interviewed residents who refused to speak. He hiked restricted areas despite warnings. He published a documentary titled Montana's Hidden Sasquatch Colony, a town's 60-year cover-up. It got 12 million views in the first week. By December, Timber Falls was overrun. By January, the Pact was broken. By February, 3 people were dead, 2 tourists, and 1 of the Old Ones, a juvenile male shot by a trophy hunter from Texas who's currently awaiting trial for manslaughter, though the prosecutor can't prove what species he killed. By March, the Old Ones were gone, all of them, vanished into the wilderness beyond our valley, leaving behind 62 years of coexistence and a town that's dying without them, in ways we're only beginning to understand. This is the story of what we had, what we lost, and why some secrets should have stayed buried. Timber Falls was founded in 1889 as a logging camp. By 1920, it was a proper town, population 847, with a mill, a school, a hospital, 3 churches, and all the infrastructure of American prosperity built on timber extraction. By 1960, we were dying. The old growth was gone. The mill was running 2 days a week. Young people were leaving for Missoula and Great Falls, chasing jobs that still existed. We were down to maybe 300 residents, most of them over 50, watching their town fade like morning frost. My father, Thomas Kern, was mayor then. I was 29, newly married, teaching at the elementary school that had 53 students, where it once had 200. We knew we had maybe a decade left before Timber Falls became another ghost town. Another story about extraction economies and abandoned dreams. Then came the winter of 1961-62, the hardest winter in living memory. Snow measured in yards, not feet. Temperatures that didn't break zero for 6 weeks straight, the kind of cold that kills. We lost power for 11 days in January. The propane truck couldn't get through from Helena. The doctor was snowed in at his ranch 20 miles away. We had elderly residents, young children, and no way to keep warm beyond wood stoves and shared body heat. People were going to die. That was simply mathematical certainty. On the 5th day without power, my father led a group of men up to the old watershed to cut emergency firewood. It was technically federal land, off limits for commercial logging, but this was survival. They took 2 trucks, chainsaws, and climbing gear, heading for a stand of dead lodgepole pine they'd scouted the previous fall. They found the trees already cut, not fallen, cut, deliberately felled, delimbed, and sectioned into stove-length pieces. 30 cords of wood stacked in the forest 2 miles from town, arranged in neat piles like someone had been expecting us. But there were no tire tracks in the snow, no evidence of machinery, no human footprints. Just enormous tracks, 17 inches long, 7 inches wide, leading from the woodpile back into the deep forest. My father and his men loaded what they could carry and returned to town without speaking about what they'd found. That night, the temperature dropped to 32 below. The wood kept 17 households from freezing. 3 days later, they returned for more. The woodpile had been replenished. Fresh sections added, as if someone was monitoring our consumption and ensuring adequate supply. This continued for the entire crisis. Every time we took wood, more appeared. Anonymous, generous, impossible. When the weather finally broke and power was restored, my father did something that seemed crazy at the time but turned out to be the most important decision in our town's history. He hiked alone into the upper watershed, to the clearing where the wood had been stacked, and he left a gift, not payment. He understood instinctively that this wasn't a transaction. A gift requires a gift in return. He left 3 things: a medical kit with antibiotics and bandages, a box of salt, valuable for preserving meat, and a hand-drawn map of the valley showing which areas were heavily hunted and which were left alone. It was an offering, an acknowledgement, a beginning. 2 weeks later, he returned. The medical kit was gone. The salt was gone. The map remained, but someone had marked it. Crude charcoal symbols indicating additional territories, water sources, and what appeared to be routes through the mountains. They'd responded, not with words, but with information, with trust. Over the following months, my father made more trips. Always alone, always leaving things, tools, food, information about hunting seasons and logging plans, always finding signs that the offerings had been accepted, sometimes with small gifts left in return. Animal pelts, medicinal plants we didn't know grew in the area. Once a piece of obsidian worked into a crude blade. By summer, he'd established a pattern, a relationship. And then, one morning in July, he saw them. A family group, 7 individuals ranging from perhaps 6 feet to over 8 feet tall, standing at the far end of a meadow, watching him, not hiding, not fleeing, just observing. He sat down, stayed motionless for 2 hours, showed no threat, no aggression, no curiosity beyond presence. Eventually, an older female approached, stopped 30 feet away. She studied him with eyes that my father said held unmistakable intelligence, not animal cunning but thoughtful assessment. Then she gestured, a simple motion, pointing at my father, then at the town below, then making a protective circling motion with both arms. He understood. You protect the town. He nodded, pointed at her, then at the mountains above, made the same protective gesture. I'll protect you. She studied him for another long moment. Then she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out something small, wrapped in bark. She placed it on the ground between them and retreated. My father waited until the family had disappeared before approaching. Inside the bark wrapping was a carved wooden disc about 3 inches across with symbols that looked like territorial markings. Mountain peaks, rivers, boundaries. It was a map of their territory, an explicit definition of what they considered theirs. He brought it to the town council. That night, meeting in absolute secrecy, 18 men and women, the town's leadership, made a decision that would define the next 6 decades. We would honor their territory, absolutely, without exception. We would log elsewhere, hunt elsewhere, build elsewhere. The upper watershed, roughly 40,000 acres of prime mountain forest, would be inviolate. In exchange, we hoped they would continue the relationship my father had begun. Not alliance exactly, not friendship, something older and more fundamental. Mutual respect, mutual aid, coexistence. The pact wasn't written, wasn't formalized. It existed in gesture and honor and the simple understanding that both communities benefited from peace. For 62 years, both sides kept it faithfully. The pact changed everything about how Timber Falls operated. It required absolute community commitment. Every resident, every visitor, every decision had to account for our silent partners in the high country. We developed protocols, unwritten rules that became as fundamental as traffic laws. Rule 1. The boundary. The upper watershed began at the old Miller Creek Bridge. Above that point was their territory. No logging, no hunting, no recreational hiking, no exceptions. We enforced this privately. If tourists showed up with hiking maps pointing them towards spectacular backcountry, we'd redirect them to other trails. If hunters from out of state talked about pursuing elk into the high country, we'd explain that the terrain was too dangerous, the game too sparse, the effort not worth it. Most accepted these explanations. Those who didn't found their vehicles developing mysterious mechanical problems, or received visits from local law enforcement citing obscure forest regulations. We protected the boundary. Absolutely. Rule 2. The exchange 4 times a year. Spring equinox, summer solstice, fall equinox, winter solstice. My father, and later, when he died in 1989 myself, would hike to the clearing and leave supplies, medical equipment, salt, tools, information about upcoming logging operations, hunting seasons, or planned development. Within a week, we'd find offerings in return. Medicinal plants, warnings about unstable slopes or contaminated water sources. Once, a detailed arrangement of stones that we eventually realized was marking a coming avalanche path. We evacuated 2 homes in the predicted zone, and 3 days later, the entire hillside came down exactly where indicated. They watched us. They protected us in their way. Rule 3. The silence. This was the hardest rule, especially for children. Never speak about them to outsiders. Never photograph them. Never document encounters. Never acknowledge their existence beyond our community. We told our children carefully, usually around age 12, old enough to understand consequences. We'd take them into the forest, show them the boundary, explain the history. Most accepted it with the seriousness it deserved. Some struggled with the secret keeping. It's hard for kids not to share something this extraordinary, but they learned, because the alternative was losing everything. Rule 4. The response protocol. Occasionally, despite our efforts, someone would venture into the upper watershed. Lost hikers, rebellious teenagers. Once, a geology student doing unauthorized field research. When this happened, the old ones would escort them out. Not violently. They'd simply appear at a distance and parallel the intruder's path, staying visible but unthreatening, making it clear that someone was watching. The psychological effect was usually enough. People would hurry back toward town, unsettled but unharmed. If they talked about what they'd seen, we had responses ready. Bear sightings, moose in dim light, shadows and imagination. We were sympathetic but dismissive, and most people convinced themselves they'd been mistaken. The system worked because both sides wanted it to work. What they gave us. The Pact's benefits weren't always obvious, but they were profound. They helped during emergencies, fires, floods, winter storms. Whenever Timber Falls faced crisis, help arrived. Sometimes it was subtle. A tree already felled across a flooding creek, creating a natural dam that saved homes downstream. Sometimes it was direct. During the 1988 fires, residents reported seeing enormous figures with water containers working the fire line at night when human crews had retreated. They warned us about dangers, unstable slopes, contaminated springs, animal attacks before they happened. My father kept a log of their warnings. Over 30 years, they alerted us to 17 major hazards. 3 would have killed people without intervention. They kept predators in check. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolf packs. Dangerous animals that might have threatened livestock or children rarely came near town. It wasn't coincidence. The old ones managed their territory, and that management created a buffer zone around Timber Falls. Most importantly, they gave us purpose. In the 1970s and 80s, when every other small town in Montana was hemorrhaging population, Timber Falls stabilized. Young people stayed because they felt connected to something larger than themselves. They were guardians, participants in something extraordinary. Our elementary school enrollment actually grew, from 43 students in 1970 to 67 by 1990. Families moved to Timber Falls specifically because they felt the community was different, though most never knew why. What we gave them security, primarily. We were their early warning system. When logging companies scouted new territories, we'd sabotage surveys or provide false information about timber quality. When federal agencies proposed wilderness studies that would have brought researchers, we'd flood comment periods with environmental concerns or property rights objections. Whatever would delay or prevent intrusion. We ran interference with the outside world so they could live undisturbed. We also provided intelligence. Through my role as teacher, later as town administrator, I had access to county planning documents, Forest Service proposals, even occasional federal land management briefings. Anything that might affect the upper watershed, I'd document and leave during the seasonal exchanges. They used this information strategically. Several times, logging operations near the boundary mysteriously encountered equipment failures or discovered unexpected habitat for endangered species, spotted owls, grizzly dens, that triggered federal protection reviews. I believe the old ones were deliberately creating evidence of endangered presence to trigger bureaucratic protections. They were sophisticated, intelligent, strategic. They were not the mindless apes or mystical forest spirits of popular imagination. They were people, different from us, but fundamentally similar in their desire to protect family, territory, and way of life, the unspoken understanding. In 62 years, we had perhaps 24 direct sightings. Most residents never saw them at all. but everyone felt their presence. Everyone understood that Timber Falls existed in relationship with something beyond the normal human world. This shaped our culture. We became careful, quiet, respectful. We took only what we needed from the forest. We managed our waste fastidiously. We taught our children that they were guests in a larger community. It made us better, more thoughtful, more humble. And then Marcus Webb arrived with his camera and his ego and his absolute certainty that exposure serves the greater good. He destroyed 62 years of trust in 3 weeks. Marcus Webb was 34, Stanford educated, with a YouTube channel called Hidden America that specialized in exposing government cover-ups and forgotten communities. He'd made his reputation revealing abandoned Cold War installations and investigating unusual FAA flight restrictions. He arrived in Timber Falls on November 3rd, driving a Land Rover equipped with satellite internet, drone equipment, and what he proudly called investigative journalism tools, but looked suspiciously like surveillance gear. I met him at the diner. Sarah Chen, who'd run the place for 30 years, called me immediately when he started asking questions about local legends and restricted areas. He was polite, enthusiastic, completely oblivious to the tension his presence created. "Mr. Kern, I've been analyzing satellite imagery of this region," he said, spreading maps across the table. "There's a 40,000-acre section that shows zero human development, no logging roads, no trails. In Montana, that's extremely unusual, and local property records show the area has been off-limits since 1962. It's dangerous terrain," I said. "Unstable slopes, aggressive wildlife. We've lost people up there, I'm sure. But here's what's interesting." He pulled up thermal satellite images on his laptop. "These are from last summer. Look at this heat signature pattern. It's consistent with large mammal movement, but the distribution is wrong for elk or moose. And these," he zoomed in on a series of clearings, "appear to be deliberately maintained. Vegetation patterns suggest seasonal use." He'd done his homework. More than that, he had resources we couldn't counter. Technology had evolved beyond our ability to obscure the truth. "Mr. Webb, I think you're seeing patterns that don't exist." "Maybe, but I've also been monitoring social media. Over the past 40 years, there have been 17 reported sightings of large bipedal creatures within 30 miles of Timber Falls. That's a significant cluster. And in every case, the witnesses were discouraged from filing official reports or speaking publicly. People see things in the mountains, shadows, bears. I've interviewed 3 of those witnesses. They're credible. A retired Forest Service ranger, a surveyor, a wilderness guide. None of them struck me as prone to fantasy." My chest tightened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I think your community has been protecting a population of Sasquatch for over 60 years. I think there's been an organized cover-up, probably with good intentions, but ultimately preventing scientific documentation of the most significant zoological discovery in modern history." The word hung between us. Sasquatch. He'd reduced 62 years of respectful coexistence to a cryptozoology cliché. "Mr. Webb, even if such a thing existed, which I'm not conceding, why would exposure be beneficial? If a species has survived this long by remaining hidden, wouldn't revealing them be dangerous? Dangerous? Or liberating?" His eyes shone with conviction. "These beings, if they exist, deserve recognition, protection under the Endangered Species Act, scientific study that could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution. They deserve to be known. Maybe they deserve privacy. Privacy isn't a right we can grant. Truth is, the public has a right to know what exists in public lands." That's when I understood. He wasn't going to be dissuaded. He had the tools, the platform, and the absolute certainty that he was serving a greater good. He was going to expose the Pact regardless of consequences. I tried anyway. "Mr. Webb, I'm asking you, as someone who's lived here for 91 years, who's watched this community survive when others died, please don't do this. You don't understand what you're interfering with. Then help me understand. Go on record. Share what you know. Let's control this narrative together. There's no controlling what happens after exposure. There's only chaos. Or enlightenment." He closed his laptop. "I'm hiking into the restricted area tomorrow. I'd welcome your guidance, but I'm going either way." I reported this to our community council that night. 18 people in Sarah's diner after closing, discussing options we'd never had to consider before. "Can we stop him?" someone asked. "He's already published preliminary content," I said. "His audience knows he's here. If something happens to him, It creates more attention, not less. What about legal action, trespassing? On federal land? We have no standing. Then we warn them. This from my daughter, Elena, who'd taken over the seasonal exchanges when my health declined. We go tonight. We give them time to clear out before he gets there. It seemed like the only option. Elena hiked up in darkness, something she'd done hundreds of times. She left a warning at the clearing, a red cloth tied to a branch, our signal for urgent danger. She waited 2 hours hoping for acknowledgement. Nothing. The forest was silent. She returned at dawn, defeated. I don't think they're there anymore. I think they've already sensed something wrong. But she was incorrect. They were there, and they were watching. Webb hiked into the restricted area the next morning, November 5th. He carried a drone, thermal camera, audio recording equipment, and enough confidence for 10 men. He live-streamed the entire hike to his YouTube channel. 400,000 people watched in real time as he crossed the boundary we'd protected for 62 years. At 11:47 a.m., his drone captured footage of 3 individuals, an adult female and 2 juveniles, crossing an alpine meadow. The footage was irrefutable. Clear visibility, stable camera, unmistakable bipedal locomotion. The adult stood approximately 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, moving with fluidity no costume could replicate. The juveniles, maybe 4 and 6 years old, stayed close to her sides. They were a family, exposed, vulnerable, caught on camera and broadcast to nearly 500,000 people. Webb's voice on the live stream. Oh my God. Oh my God. Do you see this? This is real. This is actually real. I watched the footage an hour later on Elena's phone, sitting in my kitchen, feeling 62 years of careful work collapse in 11 seconds of video. The pact was broken. Everything we'd protected was now public, and the nightmare had just begun. Webb's video went viral in a way that defied comprehension. 12 million views in 24 hours. By day 3, it was on every major news network. Scientists, cryptozoologists, federal agents, media crews, everyone had an opinion, and most of them wanted to come to Timber Falls. The town's single hotel, 18 rooms at the Timber Falls Lodge, was booked solid within hours. People started renting rooms in private homes. An RV park appeared overnight in McGraw's pasture. The diner couldn't keep up with demand. The gas station ran out of fuel. By November 10th, our population had swelled from 201 residents to over 800 people, with more arriving daily. The Forest Service deployed a rapid response team. Federal wildlife officials arrived from Washington, D.C. The state governor issued a statement calling for careful science-based investigation. Environmental groups filed emergency petitions for habitat protection. Property rights advocates filed counter-petitions against federal overreach. And through it all, the old ones remained hidden, silent, absent from the spectacle their exposure had created. I received calls from everyone, news producers wanting interviews, scientists requesting my expertise, federal agents asking about town records. I declined all of them, but my silence only fueled speculation. On November 12th, I received a visit from Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a primatologist from Berkeley who'd flown in specifically to speak with me. Unlike the media circus, she was respectful, thoughtful, and genuinely troubled. We sat on my porch, away from the chaos downtown. Mr. Kern, I've read Marcus Webb's preliminary reports. He claims your community has maintained a 60-year protection pact with an unidentified hominid species. Is that accurate? There seemed little point in denying it anymore. Yes. Why didn't you report this to scientific authorities? The biological implications. We reported it to the community that mattered most, the one that depended on the relationship for survival. She considered this. I understand protective instincts, but these beings, if they're as intelligent as Webb suggests, they deserve the benefits of modern conservation, genetic diversity analysis, medical care, protection from poaching, and habitat loss. They survived for thousands of years without those benefits. What they couldn't survive was exposure. You can't know that. I can, because I've watched this town prepare for exactly this scenario for 6 decades. We knew that if the secret was ever revealed, the old ones would leave. Not might leave, would. It's their survival strategy. When human pressure increases, they disappear. So help us minimize pressure, guide the research, establish protocols that respect their space while allowing observation. Dr. Okonkwo, you seem like a reasonable person, but look around. Does any of this? I gestured toward town, where satellite trucks lined the main street. suggest that careful, respectful observation is possible. She followed my gaze. A tour company from Missoula had already begun offering Bigfoot encounter expeditions. A hunting outfitter was advertising ethical documentation services. Essentially, guided stalking with cameras instead of rifles. Gift shops were selling t-shirts. "I'm trying to prevent the worst outcomes," she said quietly. The worst outcome already happened. It happened the moment Webb pressed broadcast. Everything after that is just varying degrees of disaster management. That night, the first serious incident occurred. A group of amateur cryptozoologists, emboldened by Webb's success, hiked into the restricted area after dark. They were found the next morning at the trailhead, unharmed but deeply shaken. They reported being herded out by large figures that stayed just visible in their flashlight beams, never threatening but making clear they weren't welcome. The old ones were still there, still protecting their territory, but their strategy of intimidation through presence was breaking down. Word spread quickly that they were docile and non-aggressive, which only encouraged more intrusions. On November 15th, a wildlife photographer from National Geographic captured the first daylight photograph of an adult male. The image was extraordinary, clear, detailed, showing a face that combined primate features with distinctly human-like expression. The individual's eyes held unmistakable wariness, and I thought, betrayal. The photographer sold the image for $50,000. It appeared on magazine covers worldwide. By November 18th, the Forest Service had established a management perimeter around the upper watershed. Federal rangers, overwhelmed and underfunded, tried to control access. It was impossible. The terrain was too vast, the personnel too few, and the public interest too intense. Hunting season was theoretically closed in the area, but enforcing that proved impossible. We began hearing rumors of firearms in the backcountry, trophy hunters willing to pay enormous sums for the chance at an ethical harvest of what some were already calling the Montana man-ape. I called an emergency town meeting on November 20th. Nearly every resident attended, along with Dr. Okonkwo, several federal agents, and inevitably Marcus Webb. "We need to evacuate them," I said without preamble. "Help them relocate beyond the range of this circus." "Relocate where?" a federal agent asked. "This isn't a grizzly bear. We can't just tranquilize them and move them somewhere else. Then we coordinate with them. We establish a communication." "Based on what?" Webb interrupted. 62 years of secret exchanges? That's not a replicable protocol. That's not science. It kept them safe for 6 decades. It kept them hidden. There's a difference. Maybe they don't want to hide anymore. Maybe they want recognition, contact, integration. They're not a marginalized human community seeking representation, I snapped. They're a species that survived by remaining invisible. You've taken that from them. Webb stood. I gave them visibility. I gave them the chance to be known. What you're describing is imprisonment by isolation. I freed them. The room erupted. Residents shouting at Webb, at the federal agents, at each other. 6 decades of unity fracturing under pressure we'd never prepared for. Elena silenced everyone with a single sentence. "They're leaving." The room went quiet. "I checked the seasonal exchange point this morning," she continued, voice shaking. "There were signs. Territorial markers destroyed, offerings abandoned, and this," she held up the wooden disc, "the original map given to my father in 1962, marking their territory. Someone had left it at the boundary, deliberately placed where we'd find it. A returned gift means a broken agreement. The pact was formally over. The old ones began their exodus on November 22nd. We didn't witness it directly, they were too skilled for that. But the signs were unmistakable. Dr. Okonkwo's research team had deployed motion sensor cameras throughout the watershed, against my strong objections, but with federal authorization. On the morning of the 22nd, the cameras captured a coordinated movement pattern, multiple family groups converging, then traveling north in formation. 14 individuals visible on cameras, possibly more beyond sensor range. They were leaving everything they'd known, abandoning 62 years of established territory, seasonal ranges, resource sites they'd used for generations, forced out not by violence but by exposure. I hiked to the seasonal exchange point that afternoon. Elena insisted on coming with me, though at 91 I was too slow and she essentially guided me up the trail I'd once known by heart. The clearing was empty in a way that felt deliberate. Every sign of their presence had been removed. No tracks, no scat, no browse marks on vegetation. They'd erased evidence of decades of habitation, but they'd left one thing: At the center of the clearing, arranged in a careful circle, were 62 stones, one for each year of the Pact. Each stone had been selected with care, river-smoothed, palm-sized, distinctly different from the native granite. They'd been counting, marking time, honoring the agreement as deeply as we had, and in the center of the stone circle was my father's original gift from 1962, the medical kit, the salt box, and the hand-drawn map, weathered but preserved, carefully maintained for 6 decades. Elena broke down crying. We failed them. We protected them as long as we could. It wasn't enough. No, it wasn't, but it was all we'd had. I picked up the medical kit. Inside was something new, a piece of bark with a crude charcoal drawing. 2 figures, one large, one small, clearly representing them, both with arms raised, palms forward. Not a wave, not aggression. A gesture I'd seen my father describe from his first encounter. Acknowledgement, recognition, farewell. They understood we'd tried. They understood we'd lost. And they were releasing us from the pact that we could no longer honor. I placed one final offering in the circle, a photograph of my father from 1962, standing at this very clearing, young and hopeful, and believing he was beginning something that would last forever. We returned to town as darkness fell. The media circus continued, oblivious to what had just been lost. News vans broadcasting reports about unprecedented access and scientific opportunity. Tourists taking selfies. Entrepreneurs selling merchandise. No one understood that the story was over. The subjects had left. What remained was just human noise echoing in empty mountains. The scientific response Dr. Okonkwo organized a systematic survey of the abandoned territory. Her team was professional, careful, genuinely attempting to minimize disruption. But they were searching for a people who'd already gone. They found evidence, plenty of it now that the old ones weren't actively concealing their presence. Shelter sites, tool caches, food storage areas, even what appeared to be a teaching site where juveniles had practiced stone flaking and plant identification. The archaeological implications were staggering. Evidence of tool use, social organization, multi-generational knowledge transmission. Everything that defined human culture, present in a species science claimed didn't exist. Dr. Okonkwo published preliminary findings that should have revolutionized primatology. The response was immediate and depressing. Skeptics claimed the evidence was planted or misinterpreted. Cryptozoology enthusiasts flooded her with crackpot theories. Academic peers criticized her methodology. Federal funding became tangled in bureaucratic debate about whether unidentified species fell under existing conservation frameworks. The discourse around the old ones became so toxic, so divorced from respectful science, that serious researchers started avoiding the topic entirely. Within months, study of the Timber Falls hominids became a career liability rather than an opportunity. The truth was too strange, too uncomfortable. It disrupted too many assumptions. So the academic community did what it always does with inconvenient evidence. They demanded more proof, set impossible standards, and waited for the story to fade. The commercial response. While science hesitated, commerce didn't. By December, Timber Falls was experiencing an economic boom built on tragedy. The hotel expanded. 3 new restaurants opened. A museum called Montana Bigfoot Discovery Center opened downtown, charging $25 admission to see photos, alleged footprint casts, and eyewitness accounts. None of the money went to preservation or research. It went to exploitation of a mystery that had stopped being mysterious the moment it became profitable. Property values skyrocketed. Developers began proposing ecotourism complexes and wilderness experience centers. The very thing we'd spent 62 years preventing, development pressure on the upper watershed, was now being celebrated as economic opportunity. Some residents sold out, made their fortune and left. Others, like Elena and Sarah and the few remaining old families, watched in horror as the town transformed into something unrecognizable. "This isn't what we protected them for," Elena said one night, watching tourists stumble drunk out of a newly opened bar called the Sasquatch Saloon. "No," I agreed, "but this is what happens when protection fails. The space left behind gets filled with whatever's loudest and most profitable. The cost becomes clear. By late December, we began understanding what the old ones had actually provided. Small things at first. Livestock predation increased dramatically. Wolves and mountain lions that had stayed away from town for decades suddenly became problems. 2 calves killed, a horse badly injured, then larger disruptions. A section of Route 89, the only road connecting Timber Falls to the highway, collapsed during January rains. The geology team investigating found evidence of subsurface erosion. The slope had been unstable for years, but somehow hadn't failed until now. We realized the old ones had been maintaining it, diverting water, reinforcing soil, probably placing large rocks to distribute weight. Their territory management had created a protective buffer we'd never noticed, because it was invisible. Without them, the mountains were returning to indifferent chaos. By January, the initial media frenzy had evolved into something more dangerous: organized expeditions. A Texas millionaire named Douglas Pritchard arrived with a team of 12, military-grade equipment, and a publicly stated goal to safely document and potentially establish contact with the old ones. He'd made his fortune in defense contracting and saw this as his legacy project. He held a press conference at the Timber Falls Lodge, broadcast nationally. These beings represent either a parallel human species or a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, he announced to cameras. Either way, they're the most significant biological discovery in a century. They deserve protection, study, and potentially communication. My team brings expertise in anthropology, veterinary medicine, and non-lethal capture techniques. Our goal is mutual understanding. Your goal is a trophy, I said from the back of the room. Pritchard's expression hardened. Excuse me? I pushed through the crowd. At 91, shuffling forward with a cane, I probably didn't look like much threat. But I'd spent 62 years protecting what he was determined to exploit, and I'd exhausted my capacity for politeness. You want to non-lethally capture them? Sedate them? Tag them? Put them under observation? That's not understanding. That's dominance. That's colonialism with a veterinary degree. Mr. Kern, I've read about your town's arrangement. Very touching. But it was based on ignorance and isolation. Modern science offers these beings opportunities your handshake deals never could. They didn't want opportunities. They wanted to be left alone. And they were, until people like you decided visibility was more important than consent. Pritchard smiled condescendingly. We can't ask their consent because we can't communicate. That's why contact is necessary, to establish dialogue. We had dialogue, 62 years of it, nonverbal, respectful, adequate for both parties. You're not seeking dialogue, you're seeking control. The exchange made local news, which meant it went viral, which meant Pritchard's expedition received both more funding and more criticism. Animal rights groups protested his methods. Indigenous advocacy organizations issued statements about respecting non-human persons. Anthropologists debated ethics, but none of it stopped him. On January 15th, Pritchard's team entered the upper watershed with helicopter support, thermal imaging, and enough equipment to stage a military operation. They found nothing. The old ones were gone, but they stayed for 2 weeks anyway, documenting abandoned sites, collecting environmental DNA, installing permanent monitoring stations. When they finally left, they'd transformed the upper watershed into a study site. The pristine territory we'd protected for 6 decades was now marked with sensors, cameras, and human infrastructure. The covenant was broken. The silence shattered. The trophy hunter. On January 23rd, a man named Rick Callahan arrived from Dallas. Ex-military professional hunter with a track record of controversial African safari kills. He checked into the hotel under a false name and filed no permits with the Forest Service. He was hunting, not for documentation, for a kill. We heard rumors through the local guide network, people who refused to work with him but heard him making offers. $50,000 for anyone who could lead him to active territory. Another $100,000 bounty for proof of kill. We reported it to law enforcement. Federal rangers increased patrols, but the watershed was too vast. Callahan was experienced, and the legal framework was unclear. Were the old ones protected? Under what statute? Were they animals, persons, or something unprecedented? While bureaucrats debated, Callahan hunted. On January 28th, he shot one of them. The killing. The details came out slowly, through police reports and eventually trial testimony. Callahan had been tracking a group for 3 days, using patterns identified in Pritchard's published research. He'd found signs of recent habitation near a remote alpine lake, shelter sites, browse marks, scat. On the morning of January 28th, he spotted a juvenile male, maybe 12 years old by our estimation, foraging near tree line, alone, possibly practicing independence skills common at that age. Callahan shot him from 300 yards. Single shot, .300 Winchester Magnum, through the chest. The juvenile ran perhaps 50 yards before collapsing. Callahan approached his kill, photographed it, took tissue samples. Then he heard something that, by his own testimony, sounded like grief. 3 adults emerged from the tree line. The juvenile's family. One, probably his mother, went to the body and gathered it in her arms, making sounds Callahan described as almost human crying. The other 2 adults advanced on him, not attacking, but making their presence known. Callahan described them as defensive posturing, attempting to protect the body. He fled, left the body, abandoned his equipment, and hiked out at speed. Arrived at the ranger station that evening, where he immediately confessed. "I thought it was an animal," he said according to the report, "but the sounds it made, the way they responded, that wasn't animal behavior. I killed someone's son." The aftermath, federal authorities arrested Callahan immediately. The charge was initially illegal harvest of wildlife on federal land, but prosecutors struggled with classification. The victim wasn't human, but genetic analysis would later show closer relationship to humans than any living great ape. The defense argued he'd shot an unknown animal during legal hunting season. The prosecution argued he'd killed an intelligent being without provocation. The case was unprecedented, legally complex, morally troubling. While lawyers debated, something else happened. The old ones responded. On February the 2nd, 3 hikers from Seattle went missing in the upper watershed. They were found 2 days later at the boundary, physically unharmed but traumatized. They reported being detained, surrounded by large figures who didn't allow them to pass, didn't harm them, but clearly prevented their movement for approximately 6 hours before releasing them. It was a message, a line drawn. No more intrusions. On February 8th, Pritchard's monitoring equipment began failing systematically. Cameras destroyed, sensors torn down, recording devices smashed. The old ones were still there, and they were done tolerating observation. By mid-February, the watershed had become dangerous, not because the old ones were attacking, but because human groups were retaliating. Protection militias formed, claiming to defend the creatures. Competing expeditions clashed over territory access. Federal rangers were overwhelmed, underfunded, and operating without clear authority. The situation was escalating toward violence that would harm everyone. On February 19th, I received a message that changed everything. Not literally a message, the old ones didn't write letters, but at the seasonal exchange point, someone left a clear sign. Stones arranged in the familiar pattern, with the wooden disc from 1962 placed at center, and beside it a small bundle wrapped in bark. Elena and I hiked up together. She was 58 now, strong enough to support me when I stumbled on terrain I'd once navigated effortlessly. Inside the bark wrapping were 3 objects: a photograph of Callahan, printed from internet news articles, a small carved figure resembling a juvenile male, and a piece of paper, our original map from 1962, with a new marking, a single X, labeled in crude charcoal, Peace Place. They were requesting a meeting, at a specific location, on their terms. "They're still here," Elena breathed. "After everything, they stayed, or came back, to negotiate an ending." We reported this to Dr. Okonkwo, who'd remained in Timber Falls despite the chaos, genuinely trying to broker peaceful resolution. She wanted to organize a formal delegation, anthropologists, federal representatives, media documentation. "No," I said firmly. "They asked for me, or my family. That's what the old map means. This is personal, not political." After heated debate, we agreed. Elena and I would go alone, unarmed, carrying only the original gifts from 1962 as symbolic acknowledgement. We hiked on February 22nd, 60 years and 2 months after my father's first exchange. The location marked on the map was deep in the old territory, a glacial cirque at 8,000 feet, accessible only through a narrow pass. It took us 6 hours. I was failing physically, sustained primarily by stubbornness and Elena's patience, but we reached the Peace Place by mid-afternoon. They were waiting. 7 adults, 3 juveniles. The matriarch was clearly in her late years, graying and moving with careful deliberation. Beside her stood a younger female I recognized from photos, the mother of the juvenile Callahan had killed. Her eyes held devastating grief. We stopped 30 yards away, sat down to make ourselves smaller, less threatening, waited. The matriarch approached slowly, stopped 10 feet away. For several minutes she simply studied us, Elena especially, perhaps recognizing family resemblance to my father, to me, decades younger. Then she gestured. The language had evolved over decades, become more complex, but I understood the meaning. Why? Why had the pact broken? Why had her child died? Why was her world unraveling? Elena responded before I could. She pointed at the sky, made circular motions with her hands, machines, drones, surveillance, then pointed at a group of figures, spread them apart with pushing motions. People coming, too many to stop. Then she placed her hands over her heart and bowed her head. Sorrow, apology, grief. We couldn't stop them. We tried. We failed. We're sorry. The matriarch watched this. Then she did something extraordinary. She turned to the grieving mother and made a gentle gesture. The younger female approached, carrying something wrapped in hide. She placed it on the ground between us and stepped back. Elena carefully opened the wrapping. Inside was a child's jacket, small, hand-sewn from animal pelts, marked with simple, decorative stitching. The juvenile's clothing, preserved as memory. The mother gestured. She pointed at the jacket, then at Elena's heart, then made a sweeping motion encompassing the mountains. Keep this. Remember him. Honor what was lost. Elena's tears fell onto the tiny jacket. I will. I promise. The mother studied her, then nodded. Acceptance, perhaps. Or resignation. Then the matriarch turned to me. She gestured at the old map, made walking motions with 2 fingers, then pointed emphatically north. We must leave. I nodded. Where would they go? She gestured at the horizon, made the universal unknown gesture. Hands spread, shrug of shoulders. She didn't know. Somewhere beyond human pressure, if such places still existed. I pulled out my final offering, a detailed map I'd spent weeks preparing, showing wilderness areas throughout Montana, Idaho, and Canada. Areas with minimal human presence, wildlife corridors, possible routes north. She took it carefully, studied it with obvious intelligence, looked up at me with something that might have been gratitude. Then she reached into her own pouch and pulled out something I'd thought lost forever. My father's handwritten journal from 1962-1965, the early years of the Pact. It had disappeared from my cabin in a storm decades ago. She'd preserved it, kept it as record of the beginning, even though she couldn't read the words. She placed it in my hands. Then she made one final gesture. She touched her chest, pointed at me, brought her hands together, then pulled them apart. We were together, now separated. The pact is ended. I bowed my head in acknowledgement. Go north, find peace, survive. She turned away. The entire group began moving back into the high country, toward the northern passes that would take them beyond our valley, beyond our protection, beyond our ability to harm or help. Before disappearing into the tree line, the grieving mother looked back once. She raised her hand, palm forward. The same gesture my father had described 60 years ago. Not farewell, recognition, the acknowledgement that we'd seen each other, known each other, and that knowing had mattered. Then they were gone, moving north through terrain too rough for pursuit, toward an uncertain future in a world that no longer offered true wilderness. Elena and I sat in the cirque until darkness fell, holding the jacket and journal, mourning the end of something that had made both our species better. We'd had 62 years of coexistence, of mutual respect, of proving that humans could share space with other intelligent beings without domination or violence. And we'd lost it, not through malice but through exposure, through the simple fact that some secrets can't survive in an age of total surveillance and viral media. The pact died not with violence, but with visibility. Rick Callahan was convicted of reckless endangerment of an unclassified protected species after a trial that lasted 6 months. He received 4 years in federal prison and a lifetime ban from federal lands. It was the first conviction of its kind, establishing legal precedent that still gets debated in law journals. The juvenile's body was never recovered. The family took it with them when they left, which seemed right. He deserved to be mourned by his own kind, not dissected in laboratories. Marcus Webb's career initially flourished. His documentary won awards. He got book deals, speaking engagements, a development deal with a major streaming service. He became the face of responsible cryptozoology. But the story soured quickly. As evidence emerged of the Pact, of the 62 years of peaceful coexistence Webb's exposure had destroyed, public opinion shifted. Indigenous groups, conservation organizations, and ethicists condemned his actions. Hidden America lost sponsors. The streaming deal collapsed. Last I heard, he's working in corporate communications in San Francisco. His YouTube channel hasn't been updated in 3 years. Dr. Okonkwo published a book, The Timber Falls Protocol, Ethics of Contact with Non-Human Persons. It's become required reading in anthropology programs. She argues that humanity's default response to the unknown, document, study, control, needs fundamental revision, that sometimes the most ethical choice is restraint. She's right, but it's a hard lesson to learn, and harder to practice in an age that treats every mystery as a puzzle to be solved, and every discovery as content to be monetized. What happened to Timber Falls? The town's transformation was swift and devastating. By spring 2025, we were overwhelmed by tourism. The infrastructure we'd maintained for 200 residents was serving 2,000 daily visitors. The sewage system failed. Water supplies became unreliable. The 2-lane road into town couldn't handle traffic. The character changed entirely. Old families sold their properties to developers. The elementary school where I'd taught for 40 years closed. No children remained. The diner became a franchise restaurant. The hardware store became a gift shop. By summer, 18 of the original families had left. The ones who built the Pact, maintained it, honored it. We couldn't afford to live in the town we'd protected. Property taxes tripled. The cost of living skyrocketed. We were economically displaced by the very exposure we'd spent generations preventing. Elena moved to Missoula with her family. Sarah sold the diner and retired to Great Falls. Mills, the ranger who'd tried to help, transferred to Alaska. I stayed. Partly stubbornness, partly penance. This is where my father made his promise. Where I spent 62 years keeping it. Leaving felt like final betrayal. I live alone in the house my family built in 1889. I watch tourists photograph the Bigfoot Discovery Center. I watch social media influencers film content at legendary sighting locations. I watch the mountain I knew intimately become theme park for the curious and the oblivious. The upper watershed is now Sasquatch Wilderness Study Area, managed by federal agencies with inadequate funding and unclear mandates. Hiking is technically controlled, but enforcement is impossible. The territory we kept inviolate for 6 decades is now trampled by hundreds of visitors monthly. The old ones are gone. Whether they found sanctuary in Canada, or whether they're slowly dying out in marginalized territories, I don't know. They've vanished as completely as they maintained their presence for generations. I hope they survived. I hope they found mountains wild enough to shelter them, human populations sparse enough to avoid. I hope the juveniles grew up and had children who'll never know that their grandparents once shared a valley peacefully with humans. But I don't know. That's the hardest part. The not knowing whether our failure was temporary displacement or the beginning of their extinction. What I would tell Marcus Webb, if I could speak to him now, I'd say this. You were right that the world deserved to know something extraordinary existed. You were right that secrecy carried risks. What happened when I died? When Elena died? How would the knowledge transfer? But you were wrong about the timing, the method, and the consequences. You assumed exposure would lead to protection. Instead, it led to exploitation. You assumed documentation would inspire respect. Instead, it inspired commodification. You assumed making them visible would make them safe. You were wrong. Visibility made them vulnerable. It made them targets. It transformed them from people with agency into objects of curiosity. The Pact wasn't perfect. It was fragile, limited, dependent on a single community's commitment. But it worked. For 62 years, both species coexisted peacefully. Both benefited, both respected boundaries. Your exposure destroyed that in 3 weeks. Was the world enriched by knowing they exist? Maybe. Does that enrichment justify what was lost? You'll have to answer that yourself, I can't. The memorial. On the anniversary of the Pact's ending, February 22nd, the remaining old families gather at the original exchange point. There aren't many of us left. Maybe 30 people now, most over 60. We bring offerings. Not for the old ones, they're long gone, but for memory, for acknowledgement, for grief. We leave medical kits, salt, tools, the same gifts my father left in 1962. We arrange stones in circles. We sit in silence, listening to forest sounds that no longer include them. It's a ritual of mourning and respect, recognition that we were privileged to share space with another people. and that we failed to protect that privilege. The tourists who occasionally wander up think we're eccentrics, locals doing Bigfoot ceremonies for authenticity. They don't understand we're not celebrating mystery, we're grieving loss. Final testimony. I'm 91 years old. I have maybe a year left, probably less. When I die, I'll be the last person alive who spoke directly with my father about the Pact's founding, the last person who remembers what Timber Falls was before exposure. I'm leaving this testimony for whoever needs it, for scientists studying ethics of contact, for communities who might face similar choices, for anyone who wonders whether secrets can be justified. My answer? Sometimes, secrets protect. Sometimes, silence is the highest form of respect. Sometimes, the most important knowledge is knowing what not to share. The old ones taught us this. Not through words, they never spoke our language, but through 62 years of mutual restraint. They could have taken what they wanted from our town. We could have exposed them for fame or money. Neither of us did. We maintained the boundary. We honored the agreement, until someone decided that his right to know outweighed their right to privacy. The pact is ended, the covenant broken. What remains is this testimony in a mountain valley that's quieter now, emptier, diminished by the absence of the people who made it sacred. I keep the juvenile's jacket in a cedar box beside my father's journal. When I die, Elena will bury them both at the exchange point, the last offerings to a peace we couldn't maintain. There are places in this world where mystery survives not through absence of knowledge, but through deliberate choice to preserve ignorance, where the map has blank spaces not because we lack tools to fill them, but because we understand that some spaces should remain blank. The old ones survived for thousands of years in those blank spaces. They could have survived thousands more, until we decided that visibility mattered more than survival, that our curiosity outweighed their safety, that exposure served a greater good than protection. We were wrong. The town paid dearly. The old ones paid more, and the mountains remember what we destroyed.